Chapter 15, Kings of Speed on the road across the UK and Europe almost constantly throughout the first 10 months of the year, their date sheet alternating between festivals and theatres, but markedly with an ever-declining diet of free concerts and benefits, Hawkwind's eyes were growing increasingly focused on America. Not even the departure of Robert Calvert, to follow up the release of the Ejection solo single with the Captain Lockheed and the Starfighters album, could dent the band's optimism. Indeed, with the Ejection master tape itself being credited to Hawkwind, and the full band present on the LP too, it barely felt as though he had left. It was more like he'd just stepped out of the room again, Nick says. We never doubted that he'd be back. He has few recollections of the album sessions. That was done at Waltham Studio, I think. I wasn't actually that involved in it. I did a bit on it. I remember going to the studio and I think Arthur Brown was there when I went down the studio. Brown appeared on record as the Gremlin, and there was a girl that Robert had been living with. Her name was Jarmila, she was from Yugoslavia. Hawkwind's first ever American tour, titled For the Space Ritual, was scheduled to begin in Philadelphia on November 23, 1973, the 10th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and again there were some hairy moments as musicians and management alike worried whether the fallout from Urban Guerrilla might scupper this outing as well. Nick would be the one dispatched to test the waters, when the powers that be elected him the voice of Hawkwind in advance of the tour's opening night, and sent him to New York for a few frantic weeks, to talk up the rest of the band. Nick was happy to go. He'd grown up surrounded by Americans, he understood them at a time when that was still a rare quality among Englishmen. Yet he was not so spellbound by their culture that he'd be reduced to gibbering inanities every time he saw another skyscraper. All the same, he admits, New York was quite bizarre. There was a lot happening, it was very crowded, very speedy, lots of music happening, and a lot of the people were quite diverse and weird, and the drugs were quite prevalent. The people he was meeting, anyway. Entrusted to publicist Susan Blonde, a former Warhol associate, Nick was plunged directly into the heart of the city's most subversive subculture, the universe of drag queens, performance artists, poets, freaks, and movie mini-stars whom Lou Reed had name-checked in Walk on the Wild Side. Nights were spent at Max's Kansas City, soaking up the sideshows that were better known than many of the bands that played there, watching them amused, but spellbound, as every Warholian excess he had ever heard on the grapevine was pressed and bottled into vintage wine. He met Candy Darling and was so intrigued by this man who looked, and dressed, so much like actress Kim Novak that he barely even registered her companion at first. So her companion introduced himself. Donald, a fabulously wealthy millionaire who sported at least a fraction of his wealth in the diamonds set into his teeth. A gem, Donald explained, which was actually his second choice. When he first had his gnashers beautified, he had the dentist inlay jade. Then spent way too much time telling people that it wasn't spinach. Nights spent at Max's were followed by other nights at the Mercer Arts Center, a purposefully seedier setting than its famous uptown twin, and the ideal place to catch the New York Dolls, the bedraggled punk heroes of American glam rock, at a time when neither term meant much to their countrymen, and the first one was meaningless in Britain as well. The Mercer was their home from home, after all, among an art crowd scarcely distinguishable from the bums and alcoholics on the sidewalk outside, and Nick's first impression was of a band that was 100% molded in a style he understood. Who dressed and played like they didn't give a fuck, and whose sax player spent half his time in the audience, playing to whoever was closest to them. The Dolls' first impression, on the other hand, was of a fellow musician, a fellow freak, and someone whom they all but adopted for the rest of his stay. I liked them, Nick recalls today. The Dolls may not have been original in Warhol's eyes, and therefore the people who clung to his every word. But you can't criticize people for trying, and what is originality anyway? Marie Antoinette said the only thing that is original is that which has been forgotten. It's human memory that creates originality or banality, which you see every time a new band comes along that we might remember from 30 years ago, but people who have never heard it before are eating it up. They've never heard anything like it. It's all about the market, and you can't be judged by the fact that someone else did something before. Hawkwind, on the other hand, promised something nobody in America had seen before. Ahead of time, various journalists dug out the same hoary comparisons to the Grateful Dead and Pink Floyd that they'd read in the English press, and a few suggested that Hawkwind were simply another example of how far behind the times the UK music scene was, that a musical experience which San Francisco had blueprinted 7 years before should now be regarded as one of Britain's biggest acts. But Hawkwind were not playing that tune. Which is not to say they weren't thrilled to be there, to finally take their first look at a country that may not, on a personal level, have ranked among their spiritual homelands, but which had nevertheless dominated their adolescent dreams way beyond the years of adolescence. Every member of the group would absorb, and take home, his own special memories of the tour, be it the groupies whose openness and enthusiasm seemed light years away from the often hesitant hippie chicks they were accustomed to back home, the landscape, itself loaded with similar openness and enthusiasm, or the sheer delight of audiences who, almost without exception, insisted they had been waiting years to see the band, and the band put on a show to reward them. It was a short tour, just 10 dates that journeyed out of Philly to New York, Chicago, Akron, Detroit, St. Louis, Denver, and Santa Monica, before wrapping up in San Francisco on December 6th. United Artists had done their promotional legwork, though, painting Hawkwind not as another bunch of visiting Brits come to make it in America, but as a traveling community, a roadshow, an experience, stateless and borderless, the children of the world. And it worked. The posters that greeted the band when they arrived in Philadelphia on Thanksgiving Day said it best: a face in shock with its spectacles splintered, and the simple legend, a victim of sonic attack. Hawkwind is coming. And America was waiting. A nation had been rotting in the years since Andrew Lauder swept his A&R gaze over all that was happening on the West Coast, and sensed some of that in Hawkwind. A nation had rotted, and turned inwards upon itself. When Hawkwind left England, Gary Glitter was number one, a riot of sequins and spangles and stomp. They reached America and it was the Carpenters. But if the gulf that separated one nation from another was vast, that which Hawkwind would be closing the following evening was even vaster. The inky void of outer space beckoned, the crushing weight of countless light years, of travel, and of music. It was just 4 years since man first walked on the moon, perhaps 4 million since he first dreamed of doing so. Somewhere in between, though, he had set those dreams to music, and, if the space ritual was the culmination of those dreams so far, then the baggage in Hawkwind's cargo hold was even heavier than they remembered. No group has ever gathered it all into such an imposingly solid image, Greg Shaw wrote in Phonograph Record. Had they appeared in 1967 or 1968, when even the Grateful Dead couldn't keep from outnumbering their dark stars with their Muddy Waters and juke band blues songs, Hawkwind might well have prolonged the psychedelic revolution and seized the zeitgeist to who knows what effect. The slimmed-down lineup was bolstered as bongo player Al Matthews came in on a more or less full-time basis. Much to Lemmy's dismay, 2 drummers was one too many for his tastes. Andy Dunkley was there, so were Doug Smith and Andrew Lauder. But there was no time for the band to build a bubble around itself. At any given moment of the day, one or other or more of the musicians would have disappeared into the city around them to sample another of America's multitudinous delights, reuniting only at showtime. Again, Nick found himself taking on the role of unofficial band spokesman, as UA's promo department filled his free time with syndicated radio interviews, and while Hawkwind would be back in the UK and back on the road with the ridiculous roadshow tour by December 10th, it was in the knowledge that they would return to America in March, this time for a far longer outing. Which is where Nick found himself spending time with the New York Dolls once again, only under somewhat darker circumstances than before. Up half the night in a Manhattan hotel room, many stories above the city streets, Nick Turner and Stacia were doing their best to prevent history from repeating itself in the darkest, most awful way possible. The first time the Dolls were in London, at the end of 1972, their drummer, Billy Murcia, Odette on smack and returned to New York in a body bag. Tonight, Arthur Kane seemed determined to emulate him, a mood which left Nick and Stacia frantically trying to avert the logical solution to the equation that lay on the bed before them. For a band that was so flamboyant, the drug-taking elements of the New York Dolls were oddly obsessed with the least flamboyant substances. Heroin, quaaludes, downers. As though something about their lives was so hectic, so thrilling, so unimaginably frenzied that the only way to get through it was to dull the senses to the point of coma. Throughout the evening, and perhaps the day as well, Kane had taken an awful lot something or other, and Nick admits, sometimes when confronted with a situation like that, you wonder why anyone tries to save a life. At the end of the day, you ask yourself why not just let them go? It's their choice, after all. But you also know that their choice is influenced by having taken a lot of drugs, so they're not really thinking straight, which is where Kane now lay. He'd already taken the overdose, and declared his self-destructive intentions, but he never seemed to have a reason for it. It just felt like a good idea at the time. Which, Nick and Stacia decided, might not feel so good when he awoke on the other side of life, and realized it was just the drugs talking. So they kept him awake. Nick on one side, Stacia on the other, prodding, poking, shaking the boy, keeping him talking, keeping him alive. Occasionally they would force him to his feet and walk him around the room. Engage him in basic conversation, try to make him focus. And when he did finally start to come out of the fog, and his answers grew more coherent and meaningful, they knew the crisis had passed. He did have things to live for, after all. Besides, Kane and Stacia were something of an item at the time, as the American blurted out to writer Nick Kent when the Dolls hit Paris later in life. The last thing she needed was a dead boyfriend. Arthur recovered, his saviors went to sleep, everyone lived to fight another day. Nick would enjoy one final adventure in the United States that fall. Faced with some free time once the outing got arrived in New York, he and tour manager Jamie Mendekow decided to take off together, first to visit Jamie's folks and friends, in British Columbia, Canada, and then to go down to Texas to visit a guy that Jamie was writing a book about, Mr. Stanley Marsh III, the multimillionaire, eccentric art collector. Canada first. They were met at the airport by some of Jamie's buddies, Rick and his lady Jane, and the biker crew. Rick and Jane lived in a shack up in the backwoods, and Nick and Jamie were escorted, with a motorcyclade, to their house. A welcoming party had been arranged for them the next day, so they had a great meal, drank a few beers, got pretty stoned, and turned in fairly early, to help get over their jet lag. Next day was great weather, beautiful forest terrain. After breakfast, Nick went for a walk in the forest to play his flute for a while, then went into town with Rick and Jamie, to buy some food and booze for the party, and some supplies for another planned expedition, bear hunting in the woods. They stopped in at the local saloon for a beer and a game of pool, and Nick purchased a gun license over the counter. They also sold guns there, but Rick said he had one that Nick could use for their hunting trip. They went back to Rick's place, and he produced a rifle for Nick, a bolt-action 303 rifle, with a box of shells, which Nick took out into the woods for a bit of target practice. He had never fired anything like this gun before, the nearest he'd been to anything like it was at a fairground shooting gallery at Dreamland, and that had been a .22 rifle. Rick set up some cardboard boxes for him to shoot at. Nick didn't impress anyone very much with his shooting skill, the sound was deafening and his marksmanship was somewhat lacking. For the first time, he wondered how he would fare when confronted by a 14-foot grizzly bear. He hoped Rick would be more competent, or that just the sound would frighten the bear away. Wishful thinking. The party was wild, lots of Jamie's old pals, old girlfriends and their latest boyfriends, bikers, creative friends, writers, beat poets, and lots of other interesting people. Nick played his saxophone along to a few records, and they all got outrageously drunk, and stoned. So drunk that, by the end of the evening, when most of the guests had left, Rick and Jamie fell into some sort of an argument about some old grievance that had never been resolved, staggering about and trying to punch each other out. Hotter and hotter grew the argument, until Rick picked up a fireman's axe from the fireplace where it stood, and started to threaten Jamie with it. By now, the only people left were Jamie, Rick, Nick, and Jane. Rick said he wanted to kill Jamie, Jamie said he wasn't man enough, Jane was in tears, and all Nick could say about it all was how fucking boring. I've come 4,000 miles to see you guys, and all you can do is try to kill each other, which, strangely, seemed to help, because pretty soon the pair were the best of buddies again, getting even more drunk until they finally passed out in each other's arms. The following day, Jamie took Nick to meet some more friends, one of whom lived on a beautiful sailing boat in Gibson's Landing, an inlet on the coast, where Jamie's family lived, and where he had been brought up. They also met Jamie's dad, Walter, who owned the local gas station, and who had an aeroplane, and offered to take Nick flying over Vancouver and Vancouver Island. Wow, when? Now if you'd like, said Walt. An offer that Nick could not refuse. Leaving Jamie at his family's home, he and Walter drove out to the airfield nearby, donned their parachutes, climbed aboard the two-seater Cessna monoplane, and in no time, were airborne. It was truly sensational, flying above the forests, the city, the island, beautiful weather, clear sky, and Walt then let Nick fly the plane for a while, describing what they were flying over. Nick tried to spot Rick's shack, and where he might be going bear hunting, but without luck. It was all so vast, stretching to the horizon, the huge expanse of forest, and the endless ocean. Too soon they landed. Walt drove them back to his home for dinner, then they drove back to Rick's, for an early night. They were going bear hunting early the next morning. Up at 5:00 am the next morning, they devoured the breakfast of champions, sank lots of coffee, checked the guns and ammunition, packed a picnic, and warm clothing, then jumped into the four-wheel drive, and headed for the wilderness. 1 hour later, they were in the middle of nowhere, at a place Rick described as good for bear. They unloaded the truck, and headed into the brush. Fortunately Nick had his camera with him, and shot everything he saw that looked interesting. Wild stuff, fungi, beetles copulating, caterpillars, amazing trees, unusual plants, bizarre things, but no bears. Nick photographed bear shit that was full of blackberry pips, indicating that bears were near, but during all their time there, no bears. Which, Nick later admitted, he was rather relieved about. Killing things for sport really wasn't his style. The following day, Nick and Jamie headed the airport to catch the plane to Texas, to visit Stanley Marsh, III. They were met at Amarillo Airport by a cowboy named Buck, in a Jeep with a refrigerator of beer in the back, and driven to Toad Hall, Stanley's 100,000-acre ranch. There they were greeted by Stanley himself, a large man in a very flamboyant black and white op-art suit. He was very hospitable, and generous. He saw Jamie as the writer-in-residence, and Nick, accordingly, as the rock star in residence. He introduced them to his family, then had them shown to their bunkhouse accommodation, and told them that dinner would be served in 1 hour. There would be a bell. Nick had a little time to look around the place. Inside the house, which was quite large, architect designed, lots of glass, lots of light, sculptures, some hanging from the ceiling and paintings, all around, very tasteful. Walking around outside, Nick saw light sculptures, built by the sculptor who built the light sculptures which were then at the Haywood Gallery beside the Festival Hall in London. Also great blocks of metal that resolved themselves into crushed cars and, some distance away, a large landscaped lake, with an earth sculpture in it. Marsh was a fascinating man. His family were oil rich, his wife's family were gas rich, and both were lawyers. Stanley's great-great-grandfather had invented barbed wire, and Stanley now owned the local television station in Amarillo. He was very intelligent, intellectual, and politically aware, but he also had a fine-tuned sense of mischief, doing things like reciting, on extremely large writing paper, to Pat Nixon, the wife of the then president, Richard Nixon, to criticize her dress sense, and duplicating his letters, and sending copies of them to all his friends. Jamie was in the process of writing a book about Stanley, the Leo, Wyoming caper, about an extremely rich, eccentric, art collector, who owns an airline amongst other things, and who gets involved in a blackmailing/kidnapping adventure, featuring a private detective inspired by Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe. It all sounded very exciting and tongue-in-cheek, and Stanley was definitely very enthusiastic about it. While Stanley worked, in an office he had deliberately placed on the 13th story of a downtown office building, to defy the superstition that traditionally refused to number that particular floor, Nick and Jamie were entrusted to Buck, to be shown around. He them the light sculpture, and crushed cars, and also the earth sculpture, the lake with the earth question mark in the middle of it. It had been designed and constructed by the foremost exponent of that sort of thing, the conceptual artist David Rauschenberg, although there was an extremely tragic irony to the piece. Whilst viewing the artwork from an aeroplane, the plane got into difficulty whilst flying too low, the engine stalled, and the plane crashed into the question mark, killing both the pilot and the artist. Lunch was late on at Marsh's office, then Buck drove them back to Toad Hall, to visit another of the sculptures, 3 20-foot-high foam rubber letters spelling the single word art. Which, while Buck looked on with laughing approval, Jamie photographed Nick pretending to pee on, just for posterity. But it was the end of the tour that had the most lasting effect on Nick, the 10 Cadillac cars, the ones with the outrageous tail fins, set in a row, stuck nose first in concrete, at the exact same angle of the Great Pyramid, 51 degrees, 51 minutes, pointing west, representing, at that time, the Great American Dream. This was the legendary Cadillac Ranch, designed for Marsh by the conceptual art group, the Ant Farm, from San Francisco. Nick looked inside the cars. The back seats contained mostly empty beer and Coke cans, and used condoms, the product of the Great American Dream. Next, they drove out to a large flat rectangular area, approximately 300 yards by 150 yards, completely painted green, with large balls, 15 feet in diameter, again made of foam rubber encased in canvas, and colored like giant pool balls. Also giant pool cues, 50 yards long, in similar materials, simulating the real thing. This was for the benefit of Stanley's friends, as they flew their Learjets over it, another work of art from Mr. Toad. He and his friends would arrange a barbecue out in the desert, and they would all fly their Learjets out to it, have a party and a meal, then jump back in the jets, and head for home. The new year, 1974, brought a new face. Dell was departing, emigrating to Canada, where he still lives today, and taking with him the last vestige of Hawkwind's old electronic mayhem. He would be replaced by Simon House, the high-tide violinist and synth player who had witnessed Group X's first ever show, and had remained a friend ever since. He auditioned, if that is the word, on stage at Edmonton Sundown at the end of January, a show which, according to the International Times, earned the band a staggering £2,500, before being brought in full-time on the eve of the next American tour, playing alongside Dell's final performances in an outing dubbed the 1999 Party out of deference to Nostradamus's insistence that the world would end in that very year, and also because it was time for Hawkwind to place the space ritual behind them. A new album was in the making, new material had been broken in during the ridiculous tour. America would witness the new material even before much of Europe. And Hawkwind would taste America, at both its best and its worst. The itinerary reversed the logic of their previous visit, opening on the west coast and then making its way across country to the east. San Francisco and San Diego kicked off the shows, together with a benefit gig in Berkeley for the imprisoned acid guru Timothy Leary, who they telephoned from the stage that night, and broadcast the ensuing conversation to the crowd. Nick, of course, was the motivating force behind that. One of his Hell's Angel friends back in the UK, Crazy Charlie, had become involved with Joanna Leary, telling her about Hawkwind and possibly exaggerating the strength of the Angels' relationship with the band. She was in London at the time, and was soon introduced to Nick. She told me how she and Timothy had been traveling in Morocco the previous year, that they'd gone into a cafe there and one of the records on the jukebox had been Silver Machine. The song came to mean a lot to them both, and as soon as she heard about Hawkwind's upcoming American tour, she was arranging for Nick to visit Leary. He continues. Joanna arranged to meet up with me in San Francisco. She had a house over in Topanga Canyon, so I stayed with her there, hanging out, says Nick, with sundry radical left-wingers who either were, had once been, or aspired to become a part of America's own underground resistance wannabe weathermen, soon-to-be Symbionese Liberation Army warriors, all middle and upper-class rich kids who wanted to be political and got involved in things, but not to their credit much of the time. We were hanging around with some of these people. Grace Slick and the rest of Jefferson Airplane were nearby, and I went to visit them one day and they introduced me to Sugarcane Harris, a really great old violinist who played with Frank Zappa on the Mothers of Invention albums. Grace and the band were really sociable people. They were aware of Hawkwind as we'd become quite a well-known band over there. We talked about music, politics, drugs, and stuff. I spent some time with Canned Heat and their manager Skip Taylor. They were all pretty cool guys, too. It was the visit with Leary, however, that remained Nick's greatest thrill. One of the first things Joanna did was take me down to the local cafe, and produce this huge bag of grass to be distributed to everybody as some sort of turn-on, really. Then we made arrangements to visit Timothy Leary, which was very flattering for me to have been invited to do. A very wonderful and novel experience. I saw it as an honor and a privilege, really. His first attempt ended in disappointment. I'd made an application to visit him, but when I flew to where he was then being held, Vacaville Psychiatric Prison, I hadn't brought my passport with me, and was refused admission. Joanna was with me and was allowed to see him, but I had to stay outside and wait until we could make another arrangement for visiting rights on a different day. This time, I did remember my passport, and I found the whole experience totally fascinating. The prison itself was extremely high-tech for the time, with electronic doors and metal detectors, search squads, robot technology, total governmental control freakery, but quite awesome. When we got into the visiting room to see him, he had his hands chained at his waist to stop him harming himself, supposedly, even though he was a completely sane individual who had no intention of self-harm. But that was the way they treated him, and it was completely barbaric. We sat and chatted for a couple of hours, talking about old philosophies and politics, about his books and so on. We touched on religious experiences, where the drugs of nature were sacraments, gateways to enlightenment to be treated with respect, as also LSD was to be seen, as a natural synthesis. We talked of science fact and fiction, future fantasies, where civilization seemed to be going, and ideas about how to salvage it, and attempt to save it. He'd come up with his Starseed project, with cultivation of self-contained meteor-like colonies, domed, each with its own atmosphere, environmentally and ecologically balanced, and supporting life, and producing more than enough food for its population, so that there would be a surplus, which could be used to supply the needy. We talked about his books and his adventures, all mind-boggling stuff. One of his theories was that everybody is a different element, a different atomic weight, and together we all constitute the whole array of elements, which sounded a quite unusual and interesting astronomical concept, very in tune with the spirit of the age. Later, I wrote a song about the experience, Time Crime, which I play these days with my band Space Ritual. I saw my brother yesterday sat in his high-tech jail / who are they to say he's wrong, won't set him free, won't give him bail. That's how I saw it. Wild schemes flew. Joanna hatched an audacious escape plan, involving acquiring a helicopter, from which would be suspended a mobile stage. Hawkwind would be up there, however many hundred feet off the ground, playing a set, and while the prison guards were distracted by the music, the helicopter would lower a ladder and Leary would scurry up it to freedom. He would then be deposited aboard Nick's private yacht, and when Nick protested that he didn't have one, she simply shrugged. "We'll get you one. Why shouldn't a pop star have a yacht?" What actually happened, Nick laughs, was of course much less spectacular in execution, but much more realistic and typically Hawkwind. We arranged and played a benefit for Timothy at the University of California, Berkeley. During the gig, the plan was to show a filmed interview with Leary, and then to have a hookup direct to the prison and talk to him live. As best I remember, all of that happened very entertainingly, but the film became a bit of an ongoing saga because I was promised a copy of it afterwards, to show at gigs and so promote the cause, but I wasn't given the one Joanna had. There was going to be a copy forwarded onto me, so I had to keep going to the airport to see if the package had arrived, and it never turned up. The whole time we were on tour, I'd be endlessly on the lookout for this film catching up with me at one airport or another, but it never did. Which was a shame, because I wanted to show it at other gigs. The benefit concert itself was enormously successful though, both financially and in terms of the publicity it generated. In between trips to strange airports in search of the package that never came, the tour continued on. Mick Farron caught the show in Detroit, and was astonished by how sleek it was. Following on from an opening set by Man, and their tasteful Welsh boogie, Hawkwind delivered and then some. Nick Turner's frog suit glows under the green light, and Chicago is fascinated. The intensity of the second United States tour has tightened Hawkwind up to an unbelievable extent. Lemmy, Simon King and Dave Brock have become a rhythm unit who stand up on any level. They seem to be taking their hypnotic, early Velvet Underground pulls to almost psychotic extremes. The audience loves every minute of them. In Nashville on April 2nd, Hawkwind experienced their first ever tornado, as the winds gathered up around the band's hotel and tore away at its fabric. In Kansas City, they discovered that the British press could follow them anywhere, as melody makers Jeff Brown turned up to discover, as he put it, that Hawkwind were selling inexplicably large numbers of tickets, then proceeded to dismiss all of their new material. But he was also around in St. Louis, when some guy leaped out of the audience and, in front of a couple of thousand witnesses, attempted to sexually assault Stacia. Twice. Both times, roadies hurled him back from whence he came, but there was another taste of America that Hawkwind could have lived without. "The whole scene is different," Simon House told Melody Maker. "People over there are much more violent. They're much more ready to go right over the top. The audiences are bigger as well. We always seem to go down best in heavily industrialized areas. And all the gigs we did in the Midwest were all very good. It's like the north of England, I suppose. It's a very oppressive, heavy environment. I suppose Hawkwind are a very dramatic escape, in both visual and audio terms. It's an escape." Chapter 16, Reefer Madness Hall of the Mountain Grill, the album that was to absorb the rest of Hawkwind's attention in 1974, was named for the Mountain Grill restaurant, 275 Portobello Road, where the band members used to gather to eat and meet. Now the place was more of a curio from their past, and, increasingly, a shrine for the more devoted audience members, but its role in the band's history was unimpeachable. One of the few places where the musicians were advanced any kind of credit, one of the few, too, where they and sundry friends and conspirators could while away all the hours of the day with nothing more than a few cups of tea and a single fry-up shared between the lot of them. Without the grill, not only would Hawkwind have starved, they may not have found any other place to actually be Hawkwind in. If its title looked back, however, the album looked relentlessly forward. For the first time, Dave Brock consumed the majority of the writing credits, but turned in some of his most concise composition in the process, the sounds of Hawkwind at their stateliest, Simon House stepping in to ensure that his violin became as crucial to the sound as the electronics which it now largely replaced. You'd better believe it, they're most self-affirming. Del's Goat Willow is brief but so alluring. Simon House's title track and Nick's Dear Rider evoke landscapes far removed from the driving reverie of old. Another Brock composition, Psychedelic Warlords, Disappear in Smoke, stands proud alongside any number of Hawkwind classics, past or present, while Lost Johnny, co-written by Lemmy with Mick Farren, is positively spellbinding, a psilocybic sci-fi nightmare which only Farren himself could ever improve on, as he re-recorded it for a 1976 single and more or less invented both punk rock and speed metal on the spot. Taken individually, almost any of the album's contents capture Hawkwind in excelsis. Taken together, Hall of the Mountain Grill is as tasty as anything on the original Mountain Grill Cafe's old menu. As usual, Hawkwind produced the album themselves. Not since their debut had they accepted the need for another set of ears in the studio, and that, thanks to Dick Taylor's munificence, and that of engineer George Ch15 during X In Search of Space sessions, had been the only learning experience they required. Brock in particular found the studio an absolute playground, and while engineer Doug Bennett would eventually be raised up as co-producer alongside the band, his influence was purely technical. Hawkwind already knew what they wanted, long before anyone pushed the record button. Or, as Lemmy once quipped, it didn't matter, really, who the producer was. Dave was always the one who was in charge. The band's schedule remained hectic, a European tour in June, a handful of festivals in July and August, and then back to America once again. Their third tour in a year, and this time pushing towards 8 weeks in length. But if past outings had been borne along by the sheer excitement of being there, and the mind-numbing boredom of the average 8-hour drive could be leavened by the eye-popping novelty of the passing landscape, this time boredom was an enemy. There are, after all, only so many hours you can devote to marveling at the sheer enormity of the Kansas plains, only so many times that the first glimpse of the Rocky Mountains emerging from what you thought was a cloud bank can reduce an entire busload of musicians to silence. The scales fell away from eyes. Urban landscapes that once appeared gritty now felt dirty and dangerous. Dealers who once portrayed themselves as the band's most generous friends now seemed conniving and threatening. A road crew amounting to 21 people became insular and irritated. And America showed the other side of its face, too, as Doug Smith wandered backstage at the Hammond, Indiana show, to be confronted with the Internal Revenue Service in all of its back tax collecting glory. Armed and dedicated, the agents impounded anything that wasn't nailed down, festooning the band's equipment with stickers and refusing to relinquish ownership until the tax situation was sorted out. Which, ultimately, it was, but only for the band itself to begin squabbling over the tiniest details, to Brock complaining that Nick was deliberately sabotaging the show by playing loudly over his vocals, Lemmy still complaining about the double drum attack, and falling into one or other drum kit as if to remove it physically from the stage. But miraculously, out of adversity came creativity. Another new album was already falling into place, and so rapidly were the songs emerging, and so determined was the band to capture it that barely had they gone back on the road in the UK, for a 3-month tour that scoured the cinemas, then they were discussing cancelling the last 2 weeks, so they could get back into the studio. The impetus behind this new burst of creativity was Mike Moorcock, stepping boldly into the breach left by Calvert's departure, and actively encouraging the band into what amounted to a full-scale collaboration documenting the eternal struggle between law and chaos, the cosmic balance that kept both in check, and the eternal champion whose job was to protect the balance itself. The Warrior on the Edge of Time was born. It was, in the form that Moorcock first produced it, a somewhat unwieldy concept, but with Moorcock himself producing the necessary glue in the form of 3 epic poems, a pair of instrumentals to act as segues between the narratives, with Brock drawing from inspirations as distant as Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whose work is quoted in Assault and Battery, Part 1, and Percy Shelley, likewise in Magna, and Nick delivering one of his most potent numbers, The Dying Sea. The album swiftly took on a life of its own. Yet the sessions would be fractious from the outset. Warrior on the Edge of Time would, like Doremi, be recorded at Rockfield Studios in Monmouth. But whereas that album was fashioned on a storm of creativity, with the band pushing towards a golden ring that they had never imagined they could possibly touch, now the fight was to keep the thing in sight. Hawkwind had, in standard music biz parlance, made it. But could they stay there, once they'd arrived? So many bands, after all, flash into the headlines with such dynamic brilliance that it's impossible to even imagine a world without them, and then, one shoddy album, one flop 45, later, nobody even remembers them. Hawkwind had no concerns on the latter count. Following the debacle of Urban Guerrilla, even United Artists had abandoned hopes of a follow-up to Silver Machine. Psychedelic Warlords was released on 45 but only as a taster for Hall of the Mountain Grill, and they'd be doing the same thing again this time. It was the album upon which all concerned pinned their hopes, and for all the enthusiasm with which the band members greeted the new material, it was the album that was proving problematic. Nick's Dying Seas was one of the earliest difficulties. No matter what or how they tried, there was no way the band could improve upon his original demo, so in the end, the demo was what was included. Moorcock's own performances raised questions. Both The Wizard Blew His Horn and Standing on the Edge, plus the unused Soldiers at the Edge of Time, were recorded twice, once with Moorcock reading, once with Nick, with the finished record ultimately choosing one performance by each. Finally, the band realized that, despite the vastness of Moorcock's source material, they had completely exhausted its musical possibilities, and were still one song short of a finished album. Hastily, they dug back into the outtakes from Moorcock's own solo album, New World Fair, and retrieved Kings of Speed. Those issues, of course, were purely musical and all were, ultimately, easily resolved. Personal frictions, on the other hand, proved more difficult to fix in the mix. Brock and Lemmy in particular at constant loggerheads. Brock was forced to play bass on Opa Loca, after Lemmy fell asleep in the studio, and he almost wound up singing lead on the final take of Motorhead as well, the self-mythologizing Lemmy composition that made it out as a Hawkwind B-side before being adopted as the name for the bassist's next band. In the event, Lemmy did stir himself to complete the recording, but there are ears out there that still reckon Brock's earlier take is the superior one. Yet Lemmy could not see how his behavior was damaging the mood of the group, nor could he ever surrender his self-appointed position as the only band member who knew what needed to be done. Nick, meanwhile, simply suffered in silence through the bassist's speed-engendered rages, and tried to keep out of things as much as he could. He much preferred quietly sitting with Barney Bubbles to scheme the artwork that would encase this latest album. Listening to the tapes as they boomed through the studio, Nick believed he knew what was required. The music conveyed allegory and mysticism, and he visualized an Eastern aura that would hint, but not howl, the heroic contents of the vinyl. Which everyone seemed happy with until Lemmy spoke up, seizing upon one of the few oases of calm in the entire studio, and transforming it into another raging battle. To his ears, nothing short of a Roger Dean-esque depiction of the album's title, The Warrior on the Edge of Time, in all its literary glory, would suffice. And he got his way. The band held a vote, and Nick was outnumbered. Barney Bubbles was relegated to the inner sleeve of a cover that, no matter how widely it is praised, and since its reappearance within a 2013 repackaging of the album, That's a Lot, became Hawkwind's most straightforward piece of art since their debut. UA's own in-house artist Pierre Tubbs executed the commission, under the grandiose pseudonym of Comte Pierre d'Auvergne. There was a warrior. He was probably standing on the edge of time. And it was a remarkable piece of work. A little cliched, perhaps, a little my first Marvel comic, maybe. But it was bold and eye-catching, and when you opened the sleeve to its fullest dimension, the other side depicted a full-size battle shield, emblazoned with the 8-rayed emblem of chaos. Yet even the sleeve was not to prove the last battleground. United Artists, too, were in an uncomfortable position. Back in 1972, following the release of Do Re Mi Fa Sol La Ti Do, Doug Smith told Zigzag, United Artists only have 3 members of the band officially signed, and we're trying to renegotiate the contract at the moment. I say trying, because I'm not having very much success. Not that I'm worried about Ch15, because in a few months' time the band will be even bigger, and we'll have a much bigger lever to work at them with. They'll have to talk sooner or later, and the longer they leave it, the better position we'll be in. Or so he thought. By the time Hawkwind's contract with the label ended with Hall of the Mountain Grill, a new deal still had not been finalized. UA wanted to keep the band on the books, of course. But Smith wanted them to pay for the privilege. On and on the negotiations went, and with the two parties deadlocked even as Warrior on the Edge of Time awaited release, still nobody budged. Finally, the band's new the United States label, Atco, stepped in. With the band having been signed up by legendary American industry veteran Phil Carson, the company was now fast losing patience with the entire situation. A new scheme was hatched. Atco would license the band's new album to United Artists as a one-off deal. And when Nick sat back, shortly after the album's completion, and surveyed his own growing dissatisfaction with life in Hawkwind, that was one of the flashpoints: the fact that either the band, or the business, had strayed so far from its original ideals that Hawkwind were able to turn their back on the friends who had nurtured them since infancy, and reduce loyalty down to a balance sheet. By mid-1975, Nick had been a member of Hawkwind for 6 years. He was 35 years old, and his heart remained as devoted to the founding principles of the band as it had ever been. Around him, however, all had changed. Only Dave Brock remained of his fellow founding members, and their relationship was at its rockiest yet. Friendships with Stacia, the two Simons, and new second drummer Alan Powell, were stronger, but were largely predicated on a shared environment and experiences, as opposed to any deeper-seated beliefs or principles. And Lemmy was just Lemmy. Was Nick bored with the band? Or was he bored with the situation into which the band had driven? When Warrior on the Edge of Time climbed to number 13 on the UK chart, he alone felt, or at least expressed, the thrill of the achievement, and the hope that no matter what else was unfurling around the band, the message was still getting through to people. For the others, number 13 was a disappointment. This time, they'd been hoping for the top 10. Maybe, he retorted, if the band had remained true to its original goals and principles, it might have got there. The benefit concerts and free festivals that once consumed so much of the band's time had almost completely fallen by the wayside now. Maybe, if an event promised sufficient publicity, the machine would crank up and Hawkwind would play. Otherwise, Brock excused the band by explaining how logistics alone prevented Hawkwind from even putting on a bare-bones show at all the events they might once have played. How, for Hawkwind to gear up for even a single show, the numbers, and though he spoke in terms of people, he was also thinking money, were outrageous. Nick knew there was an alternative. Hawkwind had lived it in the past, after all, and he would in the future. A couple of trucks, a dedicated crew, a portable stage, a generator, everything that Nick would accomplish 3 years later with his band SPHYNX was either already in place, or eminently possible, with Hawkwind. But no matter how hard he argued or cajoled, the unanimous decision was always the same. The band said no. Dave Brock said no. Was it time to quit? He was sick of accountants and percentages and manifests, sick of endless discussions and planning and talk. He yearned to simply get out there and play, with none of the bullshit spat out by the managers, record companies, promoters, and accountants, the assembled sharks of an industry that had nothing whatsoever to do with music. Occasionally, he would see daylight. On February 16, 1975, just a week after Hawkwind played 2 sold-out dates at the Hammersmith Odeon, the band was back in London, back at the Roundhouse, for what was supposed to be a benefit for radical alternatives to prisons, RAP. It was the kind of event, and certainly the kind of organization, for which Hawkwind had once existed, as Nick explains. Rap had been set up at the start of the 70s by ex-prisoners and others who had experience of the prison system. They advocated an end to the building of new prisons and, really, wanted an end to the way society dealt with offenders by holding them in prison, and to decriminalize many offenses. And all the way back to the beginning, this was the sort of pressure group that would look to Hawkwind, given the perception of us as being sympathetic to radical causes, and for which we'd play a benefit. He was grateful that they still would. And heartbroken that it would probably be another year before they'd play another. Hawkwind were by no means rich. But they had grown both comfortable and successful on the back of the revolution. Turning their backs on it as they had was more than a betrayal of the people. It was a betrayal of all the principles that the band had ever claimed to espouse. With the word claimed sounding ever more hollow every time he walked into the office and asked whether anything new or interesting had come along, and someone gestured to the rubbish bin. Another bunch of begging letters. Neither, he knew, was it Dave Brock who bore the responsibility for the situation. Not this time. Brock complained about the free shows, but he went along with them anyway, because he understood why they were a necessity. It was the industry above the band, those same record company executives, accountants, PR folk, the layer upon layer of self-aggrandizing parasites whose own pay packet was dependent upon how much they could squeeze from their contractual percentages. Years before, back in the days when Clearwater was the only other mouth the band had to feed, Nick had fallen into one of those long, rambling conversations with an earnest would-be revolutionary who argued, quite convincingly, given how high he was at the time, that the more money Hawkwind made for the man, the less they would have to give to the people. At the time, Nick knew things were more complicated than that the man was paid to perform those tasks that would otherwise have consumed as much time as the gigs, and without him, the band would still be in the rehearsal room. But now, he wasn't so sure. How many men did the man need to be? Precisely how many people were Hawkwind paying to do the jobs that just a handful had once been happy to perform? Calvert, he knew, agreed with him. Asked by Beat Instrumental what advice he would give an up-and-coming band, Calvert did not even hesitate. Keep in touch with your business affairs. You always have to be very much aware of the business side of art. When you're young, it's easy to imagine that an artist is someone who is untouched by the realities of business, and I think it's important to keep aware of the fact that your brain is still capable of dealing with practical matters. You have to be a man as well as an artist. It's really so easy to get left by the wayside if you don't control things. But Brock, in the same interview, put a very different spin on things. You've got to be very subtle and cunning with the people in this business, but a lot of the rip-offs are an apprenticeship, and unless you begin with quite a lot of money behind you, you're going to be ripped off at first. What you've got to do is be like the hunter and get ripped off as little as possible by keeping your eyes wide open. Nothing, however, could prepare Nick for what happened next. On the very eve of the rap benefit show, some of the band's equipment was stolen. And, according to the accountants, they did not have the liquidity to just purchase some more, leaving the band with no alternative but to rescind their offer to play for free, and use their share of the receipts instead to buy new gear. Nick understood the group's dilemma, as much as it is possible to understand the convoluted skeins that constitute the average accountant's train of thought. But he was also very aware of how bad it looked. A benefit show that winds up scarcely benefiting the organizers, while the headliners made out like bandits. And so it proved. Even though both Nick and Doug promptly donated their share of the band's fee back to rap, Hawkwind were crucified by the very underground they had once given so much to sustain, painted as mercenaries, hypocrites, and worse. A situation which Nick, speaking perhaps from the heart, as opposed to the head, publicly acknowledged when he admitted that in spite of our financial state, we're better off than a lot of people, and the money from one gig doesn't make that much difference. The next time he met with his bandmates, they had still to forgive him for that. I have a very casual attitude to the business side of things, he says. To me it's entertainment. But entertainment with an agenda, really? Of spreading joy and love and that sort of thing. I mean, I worry about being too overtly hippie, but peace and love are not fashionable sentiments in some quarters, and I think they should be. I think people should be at peace instead of at war. It's bullshit, isn't it? People imposing their will on other people's freedom, on their freedom of expression and freedom to express themselves. I think the only rule should be that people don't hurt each other. Or do unto others as you would have them do to you. I think Jesus was a cool guy. I'm not a Jesus freak, I think all these fucking Jesus freaks are hypocrites. He had some good ideas and I call on his ideas quite frequently. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. I think they're really cool maxims, really. And very difficult ones to put into practice. For all their disagreements and arguments, however, there was one subject upon which Nick and Dave Brock were fiercely united. Lemmy. Nothing passed by without the bassist issuing a complaint about it, nothing could be said without him taking exception. And at every rehearsal, sound check, or show, there was one topic upon which he never shut up. The band's continued employment of 2 drummers. There was no need for them, he would moan, despite the evidence of one's own ears demonstrating just what a propulsive force King and Powell represented in an age when only the Glitter Band boasted a similar percussive conceit. Lemmy viewed the 2 kits as an extravagance, financial and visual, that Hawkwind simply didn't need. And his bandmates' disagreement only forced him to dig his heels in even deeper. His constant displays probably drew Nick and Brock closer than they had ever been before. Lemmy only needed to open his mouth to moan, and the pair would catch one another's eye, and give a silent, weary grimace. Sometimes it happened before the bassist even spoke. His mere presence in the room could change the atmosphere in a moment, and Nick knew that it was only Brock's conviction that Lemmy was the best player the band could ever hope for prevented him from packing the bassist's bags for him. But even Brock had his breaking point. Curtailed by the band's insistence on racing into the studio before they left for their next American visit, Hawkwind's British tour wrapped in late February, 1975. At the end of April, with recording now complete, they set out for St. Louis, for the first show of their next stateside jaunt. With their stateside management in the hands of David Krebs, sharing his stable and several concert bills with Aerosmith, Hawkwind were now arguably big time. The papers reported on their shows, and reported on who was at their shows: Alice Cooper, Patti Smith, names that themselves devoured headlines, playing second fiddle to Hawkwind's burgeoning newsworthiness. Yet within a week, the first flashpoint erupted between band and bassist, as the party stopped at a service station on their way from Detroit, and Lemmy left to use the toilet, from which he never returned. Searches were organized, his name was bellowed. No response. Finally, assuming he had met up with someone, a dealer or a girl were the best bets, and would make his own way to the show, the band drove away. At which point Lemmy, who had fallen asleep in the toilet stall, emerged to discover himself stranded. He hitchhiked to Detroit, arrived the following morning, and maybe expected some kind of sympathy, or at least understanding for his plight. Instead, a few grunts acknowledged his appearance at sound check, and explanations were neither demanded or given. Lemmy was the bass player. So, play bass. It was a foretaste of things to come, only the next time Lemmy went missing, there would be no happy ending. Passing through the tunnel that runs beneath the Canadian border, en route to the Toronto show on May 18th, Lemmy was found to be in possession of what the customs officers agreed was cocaine. In fact, and of course, it was speed, but the border post was not equipped to actually test the powder scientifically. It was enough that, using the equipment that they did have to hand, which worked like a breathalyzer test for suspicious substances, the chemicals changed color when the powder was introduced. Lemmy was busted. The band was appalled, and despite Lemmy's protestations, they believed the Canadian insistence that he had been carrying coke, a far more serious offense than speed, apparently. Doug Smith, who was still in New York preparing to fly back to London, managed to arrange legal representation for Lemmy in time for his first court appearance the following day. The band arranged his bail, and, by the time Hawkwind were ready to take the stage in Toronto, Lemmy was back on board, the case against him shredded by, at last, an accurate identification of the offending white powder. The gig went well. Chastened, perhaps, by the experience, Lemmy played a blinder that night. But it would be the last time he did so, at least as a member of Hawkwind. While he was sitting in a cell, a band meeting made the collective decision that everybody had had enough of the ups and downs of life with Lemmy, and the difficulty of working with him. It was decided that he would leave the band, and only later did Nick realize that this was one of the only truly, seemingly collective decisions Hawkwind had ever made. The bust was the final straw, not so much because he had been busted that was an occupational hazard for most of the band. They had even grown accustomed, and accepting of, Lemmy's penchant for making extra money on the side by dealing speed. But attempting to carry the stuff across an international border, particularly one that was, and would continue to be, asked Keith Richards, as well supervised as the Canadian crossings, that was beyond carelessness and into reckless territory. Hawkwind already had a reputation as a drug band, but had thus far avoided any attention from the American Drug Enforcement Agency. Lemmy's bust, even though it was thrown out of court, had turned the spotlight onto the band as a whole, and even if they remain squeaky clean and drug-free, it's the kind of reputation that does not fade away. An eternity of American and Canadian drug searches loomed ahead of them, and there was only one way out that anyone could see. If they fired the band member who'd been busted, then maybe officialdom would assume that the rotten apple had been disposed of. Lemmy's own argument pointed back at Nick's constant calling for more community involvement, and the still absent, but fondly remembered Calvert's urban guerrilla stance, the notion that Hawkwind were revolutionaries, confronting authority wherever they could. But even Nick disagreed with that. Revolutionaries, yes. But revolutionaries who worked within the law, so they could see the revolution through. There was no point going to jail to make a point. You needed to stay out of jail, in order to prove it. That was the only firing I was ever involved in, laughs Nick, because I was the one who had to tell Lemmy what had happened. Nobody else would do it. And because I agreed with it. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, it was the result of many years of experience. Dick Mick was a little bit like that as well. He'd say, I'm the one who's got the ideas, and it's up to everyone else to perform them, and it gets a little tiring after a while, because we all had ideas, but if people didn't like them, usually you'd just go, oh, okay. But with Lemmy and, as I said, Dick Mick to an extent, they'd come up with these harebrained schemes and then get upset and angry when the rest of the band said, well, no.